Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel discussion on emulation in action. My name is Jessica Meyerson. I'm the Director for Research and Strategy at Educopia Institute, and I'm also the EaaSI Community Cultivation Lead. Today with my co-facilitator for this panel, Ethan Gates, who is also the EaaSI User Support Lead at Yale University, we are presenting Emulation in Action, a pre-recorded panel with several esteemed guest speakers and members of the EaaSI Network, which I will now introduce. Ron Nakao is Social Science Data and Economics Librarian at Stanford Libraries. Kris is the state, local, and international government information librarian and heads the Social Sciences Resourcing Group at Stanford Libraries. Michael Olson is the service manager of the Born Digital Preservation Lab at Stanford Libraries. And joining us from Swinburne University of Technology, Dr. Cynde Moya, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Transformative Media Technologies at Swinburne. Also, I'll briefly introduce again my co-facilitator, Ethan Gates, who's the software preservation analyst at Yale University and also the user support lead on the Emulation as a Service infrastructure program of work. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ethan for a brief introduction to emulation.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And could we advance? Great, to my first slide there. Thank you. So yeah, I would like to start off this discussion by quickly grounding us and the DLF community with some background about emulation and the EaaSI program of work. So emulation refers to the process of recreating virtual equivalents of computer hardware using software. It essentially allows a computer to run applications and read data that were designed for a different hardware system. It's a powerful tool for backwards compatibility. Using emulators, we can run Windows 95 on the latest version of Mac OS. We can run Mac System 6 on the latest Windows 10, and any other number of variations that you could possibly think of or encounter. Translating legacy computing hardware to a flexible, portable virtual equivalent also has the advantage of potentially releasing us from the need to maintain physical machines in order to provide access to software-dependent born digital legacy data. Next slide, please. The applications of emulation for digital collections are myriad. Whatever actions or content have been created with computers over the past few decades, we can essentially recreate and offer any number of meaningful interactions with that content via emulation. Next slide, please. However, a number of practical and logistical barriers have generally prevented emulation from being widely adopted as an avenue for access in cultural heritage organizations. Since 2018, the EaaSI project, which, as Jessica said, stands for Emulation as a Service Infrastructure, which is a Sloan and Mellon Foundation funded program of work hosted at Yale University Library, has sought to address those structural gaps. We are primarily building on the Emulation as a Service platform, which was originally developed by the BWFLA team at the University of Freiburg and now maintained by OpenSLX as a foundation. All told, the EaaSI team combines efforts from Yale, OpenSLX, the Software Preservation Network, the Wikidata for Digital Preservation Project, and most importantly, our growing network of institutional partners looking to improve emulation services by developing and scaling infrastructure for software emulation, which includes distributed management, resource sharing, improved documentation and discovery of software, and access services. So I'm really delighted to just hand things off from here to our colleagues from Stanford and Swinburne today, so that they can share their experiences and experiments with emulation as a service with you all, and give a taste really of what it looks like to take all those sorts of big ideas about what emulation is, can be, could be if we build the infrastructure, and actually put emulation into action with real collections. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to the Stanford team.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. Hi, I'm Kris Kasianovitz, and I am the Government Information Librarian. One of my focus areas is international government information. And so I was very pleased to be part of this project to be able to emulate some very important data that we have on CD. Many of you may be familiar with the International Monetary Fund. They produce a number of data sets. And they have been distributing them first in print and then on CD and now online. So I'm going to talk about our use case and introduce it. As you'll see, it's kind of a group effort. I'm kind of the subject specialist on the team. Ron is our data librarian specialist. And then we've got Michael Olson, who is our emulation, born digital forensics guru, experts, and support for all of us. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll just give a brief introduction about this particular CD-ROM situation that we've got. CD-ROMs, yes, everybody's got them. If you work at a library, a public library, academic library, special library, you probably have thousands of jewel cases filled with these wonderful disks. One of our collections that we've got is from the International Monetary Fund. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the IMF, they are an international governmental organization with member states forming the body of the membership. They also collect and publish what is considered global authoritative economic time series data, economic and finance time series data. And up on the screen here, you can see these are their 4 major time series data sets that they've got. And we have all of these in our collections. As you can imagine that with the library distribution to libraries with this data on CD, it's not unique data, but we consider it primary research data. So this information has been distributed to libraries across the globe. We started working with the government finance statistics data set just because of the kind of rich time series data that it has. We also tend to get a lot of requests for this data, and so have to deal with trying to strip it off of these CDs. Another reason why we felt it was important to work with this data is the IMF has moved actually all of these time series data into their online portal. However, they've not included the vintage data. So anybody wanting to go back in time and look at the historical data and look at variables to check it for a variety of reasons to validate research that's been done in the past, they don't have access to it. And one of the key issues that we like to point out to the IMF statisticians as well as to our users is the IMF does revise their data over time. So being able to access the data on these CD-ROMs is so incredibly important, because you want to be able to get back to that point in time when you're looking at a particular variable. If you're looking at the data perhaps today in the online portal and you might be noticing some discrepancies, being able to get back to the original data set is extremely important. Lastly, I want to point out that there is actually, through the Federal Depository Library Program, their first started was called a floppy disk project, and now they've got a CD-ROM project. So in the US, we've been focusing on a lot of our federal government information, but this is also the first project for IGOs to be able to venture into this emulation and providing access to the historical data. All right, let's go to the next screen. And this is just a nice visual of what the CD-ROMs look like. This is one from our collection. And also, I know I didn't go into deep detail as to what is part of the data set, but this GFS analytical framework will help you kind of just see kind of what's included. But it's a lot of balance sheet information that comes from governments. And this is also just a good reminder that there's a lot more information and data documentation and data support that's needed to help users with this data set. So, and a lot of times it's not all included on that CD-ROM. And so this really nice graphic comes from the UK statistics website. They've actually converted an IMF chart, which was very hard to read on their own website, and made it a bit more usable. And so that's also just kind of a nod to saying, you know, when we're thinking about the emulation environment, it's very important to make sure that we can also bring together all the necessary data, documentation, and supporting materials. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Michael to get us started with a brief demo.
Great, I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks great, Michael.
Great. Okay. So just a bit of, you just saw a photo of what these CD-ROMs look like. A bit of things that have happened. We actually created a preservation package of the CD-ROM. So we actually created an ISO of it. We've also taken digital images of the media, but also the code books that come with it, the little media packages that sit in it. So we've already created the disk image. And what I'm actually going to demonstrate here is how we would install the IMF GFS browser in a Windows XP environment using emulation as a service. So I've already booted up Windows XP. This version of Windows XP actually has Adobe Acrobat Reader 9.3. And I am going to install the application. And as you can see, one of the challenges here is we're working in a legacy OS. So these things can take a bit of, there can be a little bit of legacy or a little bit of lag as a result. I'm going to do it this way. Sometimes if you grab the wrong installer, it won't work. So I grabbed the right one. And for anybody that's familiar with old Windows installers, you're about to get a crash familiarization of what this looks like again. So what we're doing is this is a one-time operation where we're installing the IMF software on this Windows XP instance. I'm going to make sure it works. And then essentially we save the configuration one time. So we only have to do the install once. So I'm just going to open it up. And as you can see, there's now an icon on the desktop for the GFS browser. Great. And it looks like it works just fine. So I'm going to close this window. So the trick here is you actually want to shut down the operating system properly after you've done the install. So that's the step right here. We're just shutting it down, closing the application, and then we have the ability to actually save the configuration with the install. And as soon as it shuts down, it'll let us save it. So essentially, this is where we would type in IMF demo, and we can actually write in the GFS. I'm not actually going to save it at this time. This is just a demo, but to give you a sense, the installation would happen once. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague who's going to tell you a little bit more about after you have the software installed, what you can do with it.
So as Michael said, the environment's already been created. And so what you can do then is you open up the environment from the back end, and you select the environment to open up. So I basically selected and ran the environment for IMF GFS. Next slide. And so you see the classic Windows XP starting up. Next slide. And from now on, I just have screenshots of the actual window of XP and not the easy wrapper around it. So again, next slide. This is what you see. desktop, the classic XP desktop. And as you can see, there's a little icon there for GFS browser. So if you double click on that, next slide, it starts up. Next slide. And this is actually the guts of the GFS browser, for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's probably about 20 years old, so it looks very archaic and stuff, but it has a lot of functionality that's still valuable. And of course, as Kris mentions, a lot of invaluable time series data. So the browse screen is sort of the default screen, and you could see the different windows on the left, the nav bar. And so if you click on the GFS documentation, next slide, you actually can see a lot of the embedded documentation, and that is why we have to make sure that Adobe Acrobat that can read these PDF files is installed. So next slide. If you double click on that, Adobe Acrobat opens up in your virtual environment, and you can actually read any of the documentation that accompanies the GFS. Next slide. And so going back to the browser, so this is more the functionality. As a user, you would probably want to decide you don't need all the years, so you can go and click on the retrieval period and select whatever years you do want to actually get the time series data for. Next slide. And then the options tab allows you to actually sub-select countries. Otherwise, it's all the countries that's in the IMF, and most people don't need all the countries. So I just, for example, selected 4 countries. And there's other options you can also select. The other thing that I did, because often you want to transpose the view so that you actually have it displayed in a better way to do sort of time series analysis. Next slide. And so going back, there's different views of the GFS time series data. The one that I find most useful, but others can use the other ones above, is the economic concept view, which allows you to actually drill down in more harmonized ways on the time series data as presented. Next slide. So for example, I want revenue data. So I click revenue, and you can see in the right middle screen, you actually see the sub-selected 4 countries that I had selected previously. And then also you see all of the time series data in the IMF that are available for those 4 countries. One thing that's useful for a lot of people is the IMF assigns unique time series codes. So those are actually displayed if you ever need to refer that to other kinds of IMF information. Next slide. And so you can also, since you've got the 4 countries already selected, you can go through that list of descriptors to actually choose the actual time series you want to actually retrieve. So I just arbitrarily picked the first 4 for 5. So I highlighted them. Next slide. And then if you click the add button, you'll see underneath, you'll actually see all of the time series that there is data available for those series for those countries. And so next slide. You basically want to then look at and see what you want to do. Next slide. And you retrieve the data, and you'll pop up the browser. And so this is basically showing all of the data displayed the way you requested it to do. And then you can actually save or save as that data. Next slide. And name it what you want and save it where you want on the desktop. So it'll be saved in the My Documents folder on the desktop. Next slide. And so now I've gone to the desktop, and I've opened up my documents, and you can see that the extracted time series data is available for me to actually view. One of the challenges as we are able to work with the later update is actually getting this data out of the virtual environment. That's a very crucial functionality that's needed for working with data in the EaaSI environment. Otherwise, you can't do anything with it. And people do want to take the data with them. Next slide. So as Michael said, once you've finished that, then you basically need to just turn off the computer, log off. Next slide. And select the turn off. Next slide. And Windows is basically saying goodbye to you. Next slide. And so now we're going to move on to our final slide, and I will hand it over to Kris Kasianovitz.
Thanks, Ron. And actually, Ron and I may both kind of talk about some of the challenges since he's got some specific issues that he ran into when working with the software in the EaaSI environment. But the biggest issue that we quickly discovered when we first got the CD-ROM up and running in EaaSI environment was that, okay, this is awesome. I don't know how many of you had a flashback to the past with that wonderful interface, that old school interface. I had to install that stuff on our library's computers way back in the day, and I was like, I never thought I'd have to see it again, but there it was. But we were able to run that query, as you saw, and then we were able to, create the text file with the data. And we know that our users and researchers want to be able to then take that data out. So being able to export the data and the related documentation is really an important function that we've identified for the EaaSI environment. And like I said, that we want to make sure that we can also include the necessary manuals and methods and related print publications. One thing that we discussed was, would it be meaningful if we have PDFs of the GFS time series? Because the IMF also issued annual print publications in addition to the CD-ROMs. Would it be meaningful and useful to our users to include kind of all of the related materials for these different time series in the emulated environment? That's just something we're still going to discuss. Ron, do you want to talk about some of the just kind of technical issues that you ran into when you were running the emulated software?
Sure. I mean, for people who haven't worked in a virtual environment before, a lot of it depends on the server, but it also depends on your connection speed, because you are basically hitting and communicating with a remote server. So on my Mac, I often would periodically experience an erratic cursor where I couldn't quite figure out where it was, but also where it would kind of pixelate and kind of move around and unpredictably. And then also the slow processing speed, where sometimes there would be a lag in terms of really not getting immediate gratification as you would if you were running natively on a local computer. The other thing would be keyboard match. I noticed that on a Mac keyboard, it didn't quite match the Windows sort of keyboard. So I had to kind of look for some workarounds in terms of that. But that's something I think that I'm hoping can be configured when we actually have a production version of this running. I think that's probably, all that I have at this point. You want to talk about the rights issue, Kris?
Yeah, just real quick. Basically, the rights issue is that if you notice that interface that we used, that was developed by a third-party company that the IMF contracted out with. We've been talking with the IMF about the data and about this project. So being able to make the data available and release it, it's publicly available, that's not a problem. But the one thing that they said is, well, we can't say, how that company that we worked with, what their feeling is if you just allow anyone to access this, if you make it publicly available. Personally, I don't know who would want to copy and recreate that interface, because it's very old school, but that is just one issue that we're working through at this time. All right, well, that's all we've got on our use case for the IMF CD-ROM data. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Cynde Moya now to talk about her use case.
Well, hi there, I'm Cynde Moya, and thanks for joining our talk. Next slide, please. And then play it. So here's what we're up against. So this is a digital image of a CD-ROM that has a media art on it. So this, you can see the sound is a little wonky. I don't know if that's my computer is too slow in the emulation or something. It's rendered on the emulation as a service platform using QEMU running Sheepshaver, emulating a PowerPC running Mac OS 9. Now that's a mouthful. Now Macromedia Director 5 that this CD-ROM was created in came out in 1996, which is, by the way, the same year that Flash 1.0 came out. It was used by many media artists to create these interactive CD-ROMs. So it's a good thing to learn more about these obsolete software, which is more or less abandonware at this point. Next slide, please. I'm working with a team at the Center for Transformative Media Technologies at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. We're working on 2 collaborative projects. One preserving Australian video games of the 90s, the other preserving Australian media arts. Let me have the next slide. This talk is going to focus on the Archiving Australia's Media Arts project. And you can find out more about these projects from Melanie's recent talk at ISEA 2020. So, but briefly, this project aims to develop best practices for stabling the media artworks that are now on vintage carriers like CD-ROMs and floppy disks, providing emulated access to the works, and investigating re-exhibition of these works in art galleries and museums. The next slide, please. My part of this is figuring out emulated access to these works, particularly as mediated with emulation as a service. One of our test cases is the media art of VNS Matrix. This art collective started in 1991 in Adelaide, produced such things as billboards, zines, posters, and computer media art, promoting a radical stance they coined as cyberfeminism, which is pretty early for that. They now have a website detailing their historic and current projects. They're also featured in Rhizome's Net Art Anthology. Let me have the next slide. Both sites have still images from the works that I'm restoring. And these exhibitions would benefit from an embedded emulation or at least video traversals of the interactive works collected from the emulation. Let me have the next slide. So what do I have? My colleague, Denise DeVries, used DD on Linux to image each of the items, which consists of 4 CD-ROMs and 1 zip disk. And you can see they were accompanied with a directory, a text file, which, if you know Unix or Linux, is kind of Linuxy. Let me have the next slide. So I've got these things. Now what? So I kind of groveled over them with EXIF tool, and you can see towards the bottom there are some of the files are empty, which should not be empty according to EXIF tool. Some of them are unknown file types, some of them are corrupt. So it did not work so great. So I managed to use an emulated Mac OS 9 environment to examine the files. Let me have the next one. I used a different freestanding emulator called Macintosh.js to extract the files to my laptop computer for further processing. Now that is one of the limitations right now of EaaSI, is it doesn't have a way for you to take those files that you're looking at and put them on your desktop and work on them later. So they're eventually going to have that, but they don't have it now. So using other emulators has been my workaround through that. Let's see. So you can see these are some images that I extracted that are still images. So they're not moving. They're still. I did manage to migrate them using Photoshop from whatever they were. I did some other things, like I made an Excel spreadsheet where I enumerated, handwritten, typed in the file names, the locations, what EXIF tool had to say. Then I started making timelines of operating systems Macintosh operating systems, and as well as the history of Macromedia Director to try to place them, because you could see that they go between different dates. So anyway, let me have the next slide. So I spent a lot of time on this other CD called Bad Code. So you can play that one. This is pretty brief. See the sound is behind. Let me have the next slide. So I went through this directory and played each file in turn while making a video screen capture. Very annoying sound called voidoidmap.movie. And as I began looking more closely at this, I recognized that this is a map of how one can traverse bad code. For example, the horizontal center lines are stairs, which correlates to the folder that I have called Stair Stuff, that has a bunch of little videos. Now, I haven't been able to play through the CD in such a way as to find those stairs, for example. So, do I need to know more about Macromedia Director 5 to troubleshoot the scripts? Or is there something weird about Sheepshaver emulator in emulation as a service or freestanding that is preventing me from finding all of the areas of this? So let me have the last slide. My conclusion: this stuff is hard and it takes a long time. Timelines of computers and software systems have been very useful in placing, doing some of the forensic work to figure out what programs I actually need to make this thing go. Bit curator functionality may help automate some of this manual forensic analysis, because some of the stuff I was doing was just retyping things from my emulated screen into an Excel file, which just seems like there's got to be a better way. Comparing functionality across different emulators has been very useful in just wrapping my head around how emulators work, and also in possibly extracting different or more information from complex digital objects. Now I really want to get a working Mac OS 9 to compare how it acts on the original hardware. There must be some hobbyists, tinkerers, and other experts out there who have some more expertise with Macromedia Director 5. In fact, I just saw a great case study at BitCurator Users Forum from Carolina Quezada Meneses, who also reconstructed several Macromedia Director 5 CD-ROMs. She did this as part of a 6-month internship, some indication of the amount of time that reconstituting complex digital objects can take. She found that Sheepshaver kept crashing, so she decided to collect short videos of the artwork. This took her some time to map out good pathways and then stitch them all together. She called this not best, but good enough practice, which amused everyone at BitCurator Users Forum. Anyway, thank you so much, and I'm going to pass this back.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists. In terms of discussion, we have several questions queued up that we will prepare for the synchronous chat on November 10th, which will be taking place as part of the scheduled DLF program. So for now, we just want to let everyone know where you can learn more and where you can get involved. We would also invite you all, and we will share this slide presentation, which will have the email addresses or contact information for all of our panelists. So you can follow up about their specific use cases of emulation in action. But for now, we'll just point you directly to more information about the Emulation as a Service Infrastructure Program of Work, the 2021 Hosted Emulation Services Pilot that's coming up and available for all SPIN members, and easy resources, of which we have an extensive and growing library of templates for starting these conversations within your own organization, for doing spot check inventories on your existing collections for software metadata, and for thinking through a soup to nuts workflow, starting with your use case identification all the way to configuring an emulation environment, whether that's in your local node or whether that's in the EaaSI sandbox. So with that, we also invite you to check us out on the Software Preservation Network Twitter account. With hashtag EaaSI, you can also search for hashtag Software of the Week to find the latest emulated environments and software history provided to you by our very own Ethan Gates. And with that, we thank you all for watching this panel presentation and discussion, and we look forward to synchronous discussion on November 10th.